There are moments when someone expects a reaction from you and it never comes. A sharp comment, a challenge, a provocation dressed as conversation. The pause opens, and instead of responding, you stay still. Not frozen, not confused, just unmoved. It can happen in ordinary places, at work, in a conversation that turns slightly tense, in a message that pushes for a reply. You read the words, you understand the tone. You feel the invitation to argue rise, familiar and practiced. And then you don't take it. From the outside, this looks strange. Silence is often read as weakness or avoidance. People expect a counterpoint, a defense, a correction. When it doesn't arrive, the moment stretches. The air feels unfinished. Something that should have happened didn't. Inside, the experience can be very clear. You notice the impulse to respond. The body prepares. The mind lines up words. And then you let it pass. Not because you don't have anything to say, but because saying it would pull you into a pattern you recognize too well. You're not calm in a heroic way. There's no performance of restraint. It's more like choosing not to pick something up. The argument is there, available. You simply leave it where it is. Sometimes this surprises even you. You remember times when you would have reacted quickly, explained yourself, corrected the record, pushed back. Now, the need to do that has softened. The urgency is gone. The outcome feels unchanged, whether you engage or not. This can be misread. Silence gets interpreted as agreement, or as indifference, or as quiet judgment. People project into the gap you leave. They fill it with their own assumptions. You notice this happening, but you don't step in to fix it. There can be tension here. Withholding a reaction doesn't erase feeling. The words still land. The moment still registers. But instead of turning outward, the response stays contained. You hold it, and it doesn't spill. At times, this feels like relief. Fewer battles, less explanation, no need to convince. Other times, it feels isolating. Arguments are one way people stay connected. When you don't argue back, a familiar channel closes. You might notice how much energy arguing used to take, how quickly it pulled you into roles: defender, accuser, corrector. When you stop reacting, those roles don't activate. The situation loses its script. This isn't about being right. It's about not needing the exchange. The argument offers something, and you decline it quietly. No announcement, no statement. Just a pause where a reaction was expected. The moment passes. The other person adjusts or doesn't. You continue. And what remains is not victory or defeat, but a subtle shift. You've stayed with yourself instead of entering the fight. Jung would begin by looking at what happens inside the moment a reaction is withheld. Not the silence itself, but the inner movement that precedes it. The impulse still appears. The body still prepares. Words rise, familiar and ready. What changes is not the impulse, but the relationship to it. From Jung's perspective, reacting is often automatic. A learned pattern. The psyche responds to threat, challenge, or tension by defending, correcting, or asserting. Arguing back is rarely a conscious choice. It's a reflex shaped by past experiences, roles, and expectations. When someone stops arguing back, Jung would see a break in that reflex. He would notice that the impulse does not disappear. It is felt, recognized, and then contained. This containment is important. Jung believed that maturity in the psyche comes not from eliminating impulses, but from holding them without being ruled by them. Withholding reaction is not emptiness, it is capacity. Inside, this can feel like a tightening followed by space. The urge to respond presses forward, and instead of being released outward, it settles inward. Jung would say this is where awareness enters. The person sees the impulse as something they have, not something they are. That separation changes everything. He would also look at the role of the shadow here. Arguments often carry shadow material, projections, old wounds, the need to be right, the need to be seen. When someone argues back, they may be defending more than the present moment. When they don't, some of that shadow loses its immediate outlet. This doesn't mean the shadow is gone, it means it's being held. Jung would consider this a form of integration. The person allows the feeling to exist without acting it out. That restraint is not suppression if it's conscious. It's choice. Jung would also notice how identity shifts here. Many people know themselves through reaction, through positions taken, through winning or losing exchanges. When reaction is withheld, those identities don't activate. The person remains less defined by opposition. That can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. From the inside, this often feels quieter than expected. The argument promises release. When it doesn't happen, there is no explosion, no collapse, just a steadiness. Jung would say the psyche is learning that it does not need discharge to remain whole. He would caution that this only works when the withholding is intentional. When silence comes from fear, the impulse stays trapped and grows heavier. But when silence comes from awareness, the energy transforms. It becomes observation instead of action. In Jung's lens, not arguing back is not passivity. It is an inner reorganization, a shift from being driven by reaction to being guided by consciousness. The person does not disappear from the moment. They remain present, but no longer governed by the need to respond. What stays behind is not agreement or defeat, it's containment. And containment, for Jung, is where the self begins to hold its own center. Nietzsche would look at the moment of non-response and recognize it as a refusal to enter a familiar game. Arguing back is rarely just about disagreement. It is a ritual, a way of proving position, strength, intelligence, or moral standing. When someone withholds reaction, Nietzsche would say they are not losing the game, they are declining to play it. From his view, argument feeds on recognition. It requires an opponent. It needs friction to feel real. Each response confirms the rules of the exchange and the values behind it. Right and wrong, strong and weak, winner and loser. When someone does not argue back, the structure begins to wobble. The exchange cannot complete itself. Nietzsche was deeply attentive to how much of social life is driven by reactive forces. People respond because they feel pushed, challenged, provoked. They react not from choice, but from habit, from a need to defend an identity that feels threatened. Arguing back becomes a way to reassure oneself of one's position in the hierarchy of meaning. So when reaction is withheld, Nietzsche would not see passivity. He would see distance. A step taken out of the reactive loop. The person is no longer measuring themselves against the provocation. They are no longer letting the other person set the terms of engagement. This can be unsettling to watch. The absence of response creates a vacuum. The one who provoked waits for resistance that never arrives. The expected escalation stalls. Nietzsche would note how quickly this absence gets reinterpreted. Silence is called weakness. Calm is called avoidance. Non-reaction is framed as failure. These judgments protect the game. They explain why it didn't work. Nietzsche would say that argument often serves to preserve shared values, not to discover truth. By reacting, you affirm that the exchange matters, that the terms are valid. By withholding reaction, you quietly suggest that the values being defended are no longer authoritative for you. This refusal is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't try to convince anyone. That is what gives it weight. There is no counter-argument to fight, no position to dismantle. Just a person who remains untouched by the provocation. Nietzsche would also recognize the cost. Stepping out of reactive exchange can look like disengagement. Others may feel dismissed or invalidated. The person who withholds reaction may be misread as indifferent or superior. Nietzsche knew that refusing shared games often leads to misunderstanding and isolation, but he would insist that this kind of refusal is not negation. It is selection. The person is choosing where their energy goes. They are no longer willing to be moved by every challenge that comes their way. They do not need to prove themselves through opposition. In this lens, not arguing back is not silence born of fear. It is silence born of clarity. A recognition that some exchanges exist only to keep the machinery of reaction turning, and that refusing to react is sometimes the most decisive move available. The argument waits. The response never comes. Arendt would look at what happens socially when someone does not argue back. Not the intention behind the silence, and not the inner calm or tension it may contain, but the disruption it creates in shared space. For her, public life depends on response. Speech calls for speech. Action expects reaction. When that chain breaks, the structure around it has to adjust. Arguing back is one of the most reliable ways people signal participation. It confirms presence. It shows that someone is engaged, invested, and willing to stand inside the shared rules of exchange. Even conflict reinforces belonging. When you argue, you acknowledge the other person as a partner in the same public world. So when someone withholds reaction, Arendt would say something subtle but important happens. The person is still there, still listening, still present. But they are no longer performing participation in the expected way. The conversation loses its symmetry. One side speaks into a space that no longer answers back. This creates discomfort, not because silence is hostile, but because it interrupts coordination. Public interactions rely on predictable responses: agreement, disagreement, defense, escalation. These patterns allow people to move together without constantly renegotiating the rules. When a response doesn't come, the rhythm stutters. Arendt would notice how quickly others try to restore that rhythm. They repeat themselves, they sharpen their point, they soften their tone, they provoke more directly. All of these are attempts to pull the silent person back into the exchange, to make the space legible again. When that still doesn't work, the meaning of the silence begins to shift. It is no longer just a pause. It becomes a signal of its own. Not a statement, but an absence that others must interpret. And interpretation fills the gap where response should have been. Silence can be read as agreement, or dismissal, or superiority, or weakness. Arendt was deeply aware that meaning in public life is rarely fixed. It emerges from interaction. When interaction stops on one side, meaning becomes unstable. People project into the silence whatever restores their sense of order. She would also point out that withholding reaction changes power dynamics. Arguments distribute power through exchange. Each response gives the other person something to work with. When one side stops reacting, that leverage disappears. The speaker may feel exposed, unsupported, or strangely alone in their position. This is not because the silent person has taken control, but because they have stepped out of the shared mechanism. Arendt would say that public life does not know what to do with non-participation that is neither withdrawal nor opposition. It doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. Over time, this can lead to quiet exclusion, not as punishment, but as adaptation. The group may stop directing arguments toward the person who doesn't respond, not out of respect, but out of efficiency. Interaction flows toward those who answer back. From Arendt's lens, not arguing back is not just a personal choice. It is a social event. It alters how space is shared, how voices circulate, and how attention moves. The silence does not shout. It simply changes the geometry of the room, and that change lingers. Camus would recognize this moment as a quiet refusal that doesn't need explanation. Not arguing back is not the same as surrender. It's not agreement. It's not fatigue. It's a decision to stop feeding something that only survives through reaction. He was interested in gestures that don't announce themselves, acts that don't try to correct the world or persuade it. Withholding reaction fits here. The argument asks for participation. It offers meaning through opposition, and you leave that offer unanswered. From Camus's view, many conflicts persist not because they matter deeply, but because people keep responding to them. Each reply gives the exchange new air. Each defense keeps the structure standing. When reaction is withheld, the structure doesn't collapse dramatically. It simply loses momentum. There is dignity in that. Not the kind that proves itself, the kind that stays intact without display. Camus would say that choosing not to argue back is choosing not to live inside every demand placed on you. It's a way of protecting your time, your energy, your inner coherence. This doesn't make the world quieter. Others may keep talking. They may escalate. They may fill the silence with interpretation. Camus would not rush to correct that. He understood that meaning is often imposed where none is offered. Silence invites projection. That is not a flaw. It is a consequence. What matters is that the person who withholds reaction remains present to themselves. They don't disappear. They don't numb out. They simply refuse to be pulled into a cycle that feels empty or repetitive. The refusal is internal first. The outer silence follows. Camus would also acknowledge the loneliness in this. Arguing is one way people connect. When you stop doing it, some connections thin, some conversations end sooner, some relationships lose their usual shape. This is not punishment. It's the cost of not performing. But he would say that not every cost is a loss. Some are exchanges. You give up the noise of constant response, and you gain a steadier sense of yourself. You stop needing to win, defend, or explain in every moment. You let the world keep its urgency without adopting it as your own. In the end, Camus would not frame this as a philosophy to follow. Just an observation. Some people discover that the most honest response is no response at all. Not because nothing is felt, but because nothing needs to be acted out. The argument waits. The reaction never comes. And life continues, quieter on one side,